The goal is important only as an idea. The essential thing is the opus, which leads to the goal. That is the goal of a lifetime. In its attainment, left and right are united, and conscious and unconscious work in harmony. Individuation, the inner opus, Carl Jung's psychological concept of an at-one-ment with oneself, reminds me of a fingerprint. We're all born with one, yet each fingerprint is unique to the individual. Your journey, your opus, your art is unique to you and you alone, and because of this, the only way to unfold it all is through thyself. This video series on individuation is not designed to explain to you how to individuate, as this would be rather heretical, but to speak on alchemical symbols that objectively point to the same bridge which lights the way. That collective eternal bridge which provides us all our unique fingerprints and the intelligence behind our unfoldment. A truly eternal path because it is the same elusive essence that crosses space, being in both you and I, and time, as we will see it was in Jung as well as the alchemists. If you're just dipping your feet into this inner reality, or achieve the white tincture on the way to the red stone, this plunge into individuation is tailored for all interested or aware of this natural, instinctual unfoldment of consciousness. Throughout the video series, we will explore all 20 woodcuts from the philosophorum, beginning with the 10 woodcuts that Jung interprets in his psychology of the transference. And while he does use these symbols to describe the transference, there's a deeper psychological truth linked to individuation that I'd like to focus on. The woodcuts, as I said, were derived from the philosophorum, or in English, the Rosary of the Philosophers. Within this 16th century text, as the title hints, lies alchemical and philosophical sayings. And for those familiar with Jung's own alchemical work, you'll notice that he refers to the Rosarium quite often. But this series will not focus on the text, but the symbolic side of the Rosarium, which seems to portray an arrangement of images capturing certain sages along the way of the opus, all culminating to the creation of the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. And as everything is symbolic in the woodcuts as we will explore, you will see our journey takes us into the spiritual side of alchemy. On this, Carl Jung adds, we find that alchemy did not merely change into chemistry by gradually discovering how to break away from its mythological premises, but that it also became, and has always been, a kind of mystical philosophy. Throughout this series, we will explore consciousness transmute itself from its childlike, subjective, inflated or possessed egotistical state to a true, objective, balanced and aware account of reality. Just as the alchemist hundreds of years ago entered his or her mystical great work to actualize the philosopher's stone, an opus of which a goal of a lifetime is achieved, we will be seeing how the ego enters its own great work, its own opus of individuation, to unfold and actualize the self, just as the alchemists create their philosopher's stone. It's a universal symbol that awaits unfoldment in each individual. There's only one problem with what is to come throughout this series, a problem linked to unfolding this spiritual concept of the philosopher's stone. Individuation, the unconscious, the soul, the ego, all that will be discussed in the space of psyche are invisible. They're in a space beyond the physical. But one can never forget, the beauty of any problem is that there's always its opposite, a solution. And just like evaluating a dream, our solution to this problem is through the symbols where we can begin to see, feel, grasp the inner invisible realities. They allow them to come to life. These symbols in the Rosarium, just like any symbol, act as if a myth or story. They all point to something of which the words or images are representing, but this is all that they're used for, pointing elsewhere. It's wise not to become fixated or attached to words, or in this case symbols, as it's not the forms, the images, but that which creates the forms and images which is real and requires our attention. Any instinct arising from within the unconscious is always outside the ego's beliefs and will. It is what it is, regardless of your opinion, which is why I like to call individuation a partaking in the instinctual unfoldment of consciousness. The instinct is this other part of being which comes through rather unconsciously, and the partaking of this instinctual unfoldment is as simple as the ego reflecting on this material to allow it to become wholly as it is, not possessed and acting it out, projecting it elsewhere, distracting oneself with the stimulant, or repressing it away into shadowland, but purely looking at it. With consciousness contained in such an environment, the grounds of transformation are fertile. And what is rather interesting to reflect on, for those who haven't made this deeper connection, is that an instinct and the spirit are all of the same reflexive essence. When you get an intuition, there's no reasoning. When you're provided that synchronistic sign that you're on the way, it all just comes, unconsciously. On this, Jung writes, "We know that it is possible to interpret the fantasy contents of the instincts either as signs, self-portraits of the instincts, i.e. reductively, or as symbols, as the spiritual meaning of the natural instinct. In the former case, the instinctual process is taken to be real, and in the latter, unreal. In any particular case, it is often almost impossible to say what is spirit and instinct. Together they form an impenetrable mass, a veritable magma sprung from the depths of primeval chaos." So we're not taking this journey to extract knowledge from the symbols, but to feel the essence, the energy that instinctually, spiritually arises. Jung himself says it best. The remarkable effects produced by unconscious contents allow us to infer something about their energy. All unconscious contents, once they are activated, i.e., have made themselves felt, possess as if it were a specific energy which enables them to manifest themselves everywhere. This is an important focus of this series, to feel the energy behind the psychic instincts, just as one's own inner opus should proceed, not only knowledgeable in the physical, i.e. words or images, but also intelligible to the spiritual, i.e. the essence. And this is especially true when discussing the idea of individuation, because anytime a logical ego gets its hands on something, it enters the world of time and space, the world of creation. But we are here dealing with a phenomena that's not only in time and space, but outside it. And it's important to remember that individuation is not a linear path, but circular. As we will come to see, it's all about an expansion of awareness. And to expand awareness isn't a line, but a circle. At one moment, it seems white, but then it's black. To believe you know your way, to believe you figured out individuation, to feel confident after we explore these 20 woodcuts is something I'd advise you from, because as I said, it's not something to be figured out, and this pride will only distract you from the way. As we proceed into each of the 20 images, the formula will be simple and condensed. First, I'll show the woodcuts as a whole, introducing it briefly, and then we'll dive into the parts, the symbols, with interpretations provided by Jung. Jung helps us bridge the connection from alchemy to psychology. And as we close out each image, I'll generalize what it all means for individuation. This will be the formula for the first 10 images. The final 10, we don't have Jung's specific interpretation of the symbolism. In the psychology of the transference, he only discusses, as I said, the first 10. So the final 10 I'll briefly discuss, as well as bring forth what Jung may add to the symbolism using his other alchemical works, such as Mysterium Connotationes. So with this brief introduction, I'll leave you with a quote Jung begins his psychology of the transference with, a quote which leads us into this medieval symbolic journey of individuation. "I inquire, I do not assert. I do not here determine anything with final assurance. I conjecture, try, compare, attempt, ask." We are the metal's first nature and only source. The highest tincture of the art is made through us. No fountain and no water has my like. I make both rich and poor, both whole and sick. For healthful can I be, and poisonous. Jung begins the chapter on this first woodcut. This picture goes straight into the heart of alchemical symbolism, for it is an attempt to depict the mysterious basis for the opus. The basis for the opus, or individuation, is portrayed throughout the symbolism of this image. And the key word to grasp from Jung is that it's all mysterious. The title of this image, all provided by Jung, hints at what the mystery is all about. And it's of course named Mercurius, which you'll come to see is known in Jungian terms as the self. Before continuing into this woodcut, I want to read a quote from Jung's Spirit Mercurius to get a feel for this elusive, mysterious essence. Our center of focus for both this image and what is to come throughout the series. On it, Jung wrote, "Because of his united double nature, Mercurius is described as hermaphroditic. Sometimes his body is said to be masculine and his soul feminine, sometimes the reverse. The Rosarian Philosophorum, for example, has both versions. As Vulgaris, he is the dead masculine body, but as our Mercurius, he is feminine, spiritual, alive, and life-giving. He is also the husband and wife, bridegroom and bride, or lover and beloved. His contrary natures are often called Mercurius, sensu strictori and sulfur, the former being feminine, earth and Eve, and the latter masculine, water and Adam. In Dorn he is the true hermaphroditic Adam, and in Kunrith he is the begotten of the hermaphroditic seed of the macrocosm, as immaculate birth from the hermaphroditic matter, i.e. the prima materia. Jung then connects this idea of Mercurius to the anthropos or first man, and links it all with his concept of the self. Nevertheless, I would like to emphasize once again that the anthropos idea coincides with the psychological concept of the self. The Atman or Purusha doctrine, as well as alchemy, gives clear proofs of this. Mercurius is a name which coincides with the anthropos and the self, so this essence that all these names are pointing towards is one and the same, something eternal. And just like anything eternal, the beginning is the end, and the end is the beginning. Yes, the goal for the alchemist is the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, actualizing the self. But it all begins with the prima materia, or the raw, crude, unactualized consciousness. It is all truly paradoxical. Jung, in his magnum opus Mysterium Conjunctiones, speaks on alchemists and their paradoxes, writing, "The tremendous role that the opposites and their union play in alchemy help us understand why alchemists were so fond of paradoxes. In order to obtain their union, they tried not only to visualize the opposites together, but to express them in the same breath. Characteristically, the paradoxes cluster most thickly around the arcane substance, which was believed to contain the opposites in uncombined form as the prima materia, and to amalgamate them as the lapis philosophorum. Thus the lapis is called on one hand base, cheap, immature, volatile, and on the other hand precious, perfect, and solid, or the prima materia is the base and noble, or precious and parvii momenti, of little moment." A footnote on this section in the Mysterium furthers, by lapis is meant both the initial material, the prima materia, and the end product of the opus, the lapis in its strict sense. This is important for anyone interested in consciousness as a whole, or any inner work. Everything's all there in the beginning. It's a bit of a massa confusa to the ego. And even though it's all there, it's still not a process of grabbing knowledge to create a self, but to see it, realize it, and allow it to come through, using what the ego's true functioning is, that being awareness. The awareness allows the unfoldment to proceed, because it is the unconscious which is seeking consciousness, and the end product of it all is still the same whole self as the beginning. The only difference is that it is actualized. To view this in terms of energy, one can see how the prima materia is an undifferentiated state of potential energy, whereas the lapis philosophorum would represent a differentiated and actualized state of kinetic energy. So before we proceed into the parts of this image, the symbols, it was wise to get a perspective of what the whole represents. That being the arcane substance, the all-in-one, the thousand-named, Mercurius to the alchemist, the self to Jung, or another way to see it, the essence of consciousness, both personal and collective, conscious and unconscious. I like to call this image the manifestations of Mercurius, of thyself, not only because of its elusive essence weaving through its various forms, but also how we will see the essence throughout the symbolism in this woodcut show up throughout each stage of the opus. Everything's intertwined in and through it. Now let's take a look at the parts of this first woodcut, the specific symbols, and Jung's interpretation of each. At the start of the chapter titled The Mercurial Fountain, Jung begins with the symbol of the stars. It, the image as a whole, is a quadratic quaternity characterized by the 4 stars in the 4 corners. These are the 4 elements. Above, in the center, there is a 5th star which represents the 5th entity, the one derived from the 4, the quinta essentia. We see a trademark for the world of creation, the conscious realm, with the quaternity and the 4 stars. This can be viewed as the 4 elements, the 4 seasons, any pair of 4 related to time and space. A psychic connection to the 4, which Jung notes in this chapter, is his own 4 functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. As for the 1, the quinta essentia, or 5th essence, this represents in Jungian terms the self. The connection of the 4 and the 1 hints at the idea of unfoldment through the 4 and enfoldment through the 1. It's also connected to another symbol that Jung was interested in throughout his entire life, that being a mandala. So the realm of the ego, the conscious and the 4, and the idea of the 1, the whole self, have been highlighted, which brings us to the opposite side of consciousness, or 95% of consciousness, the unconscious. It is represented in the circular basin below the star at the base of the fountainhead. The basin below is the vas hermeticum, where the transformation takes place. It contains the mare nostrum, the aqua permanens, or the divine water. This is the mare tenebrosum, the chaos. This basin, in contrast with the surrounding square, is circular, because it is the matrix of the perfect form into which the square, an imperfect form, must be changed. In the square, the elements are still separate and hostile to one another, and must therefore be united in the circle. Squaring the circle is a symbol for wholeness, a symbol connected to the alchemists as well as the goal of the opus, the philosopher's stone. In psychological terms, this is an integration of conscious and unconscious, that mysterium conjunction. And it is the symbol of Christ on the cross which deepens this connection of the 4 and the 1. The square, the 4, represents the cross, and the 1 is Jesus on the cross. Throughout Jung's work, he connects the idea of the self with Jesus, while the 4 are related again to the 4 functions of the ego. So when those 4 are united in the water, the 1 emerges. Think about it. Jesus doesn't only bleed blood, but also water. This will come back shortly, so let us return to the basin which holds the aqua permanens, the divine water. Around the rim, one notices Latin writing. Jung comments, it runs, Unus est mercurius minerales, mercurius vegetables, mercurius animales. Vegetables should be translated as living, and animales as animate, in the sense of having a soul or even psychic. This inscription is a nod to the 3 separate manifestations of this same essence, Mercurius. Jung adds a footnote that has 2 separate alchemical quotes which expand on the meaning of this inscription. Hence the parts of the world are infinite, all of which the philosopher divides into 3 parts, namely mineral, vegetable, animal, and therefore he claims to have the 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world, which parts are contained in the single stone, namely the Mercurius of the philosophers. And this stone is called perfect because it has in itself the nature of mineral, vegetable, and animal. For the stone is triple in one, having 4 natures. You see Mercurius run through all worlds, and I was drawn to Jung's own work in Ion as he portrays the self using geometrical shapes, octahedrons, in its various forms throughout the universe. Continuing on the outside of the basin, we find 6 stars, to which Jung adds, on the outside of the basin there are 6 stars which together with Mercurius represent the 7 planets or metals. They are all as it were contained in Mercurius, since he is the Pater Metallorum. When personified, he is the unity of the 7 planets, and Anthropos whose body is the world, like Gaimart from whose body the 7 metals flow into the earth. Owing to his feminine nature, Mercurius is also the mother of the seven, and not only of the six, for he is his own father and mother. That idea we spoke on earlier, the anthropos connection to the alchemical Mercurius, is remarked here. It's truly impressive to reflect upon the transcendental range attributed to Mercurius. Continuing up to the top of the fountain, we find 3 pipes. While we've highlighted the 4 and the 1, it is now the triad which will be in focus. Jung writes, out of the sea then arises this Mercurial Fountain, triplex nomen, as is said with reference to the 3 manifestations of Mercurius. He is shown flowing out of 3 pipes in the form of lac virginis, virgin's milk, estum fontes, spring vinegar, and aqua vitae, water of life. These are 3 of his innumerable synonyms. The aforementioned unity of Mercurius is here represented as a triad. It is repeatedly emphasized that he is the Trinity, Trinus or Trinus, the chthonic, lower, or even infernal counterpart of the heavenly Trinity, just as Dante's devil is 3-headed. As for more specifics on the 3 pipes, I'll leave this for you to explore, as many interpretations may arise from this, such as the mercurial divine water flowing through the body, soul, and spirit. What I will note is that idea of action, of flowing, of movement through the pipes, as well as the virgin's milk leaning towards the feminine side of Mercurius, whereas the spring vinegar leans towards the masculine. And speaking of the masculine and feminine, we find a timeless symbol of each just above the phallic-like fountainhead. The masculine sun and feminine moon stand opposed and looking at each other, a pair that'll show up throughout the series, as the masculine and feminine are traits eternally connected to the nature of consciousness. On them, Jung writes, above the 3 pipes we find the sun and moon, who are the indispensable acolytes and parents of the mystical transformation. The parents of mystical transformation, or individuation, will be with us throughout the series, so there's no need to dwell upon them now. And because of that, at this point, we've covered just about everything in this first woodcut. All that remains is the twin-headed serpent and the hazy, misty vapor emanating out of their mouths. On this, Jung says, at the top of the picture is the serpens bifidus, the divided or twin-headed serpent, the fatal binary, which Dorn defines as the devil. The serpent is the serpens mercurialis, mercurial serpent, representing the duplex natura, double nature of Mercurius. The heads are spitting forth fire, from which Maria the Jewess derived her duo fumi, 2 smoke. These are the 2 vapors whose condensation initiates the process which leads to multiple sublimation and distillation for the purpose of purifying away the maleodores, bad smells, the vultor speculum, the stench of the graves, and the clinging darkness of the beginning. Of course, Jung says it is connected to the devil, but that devil is us. Some say the ego is the devil of consciousness, and the key feature of subjectivity of the ego, of consciousness, is our brain. And the brain, just like the serpent, is dual. There are 2 hemispheres. And this is not a reach on my part, as Jung himself adds in a footnote from Mysterium Connotationes. Penotis therefore correlates the brain with the snake, to whom the first parents owed their first independent action. The Gnostic Gnos and the serpents Mercurialis of the alchemists play a similar role. The brain can be seen as the body of the work, that physical basin in which the divine water, the spirit of Mercurius, moves through. And it is the brain, through our conscious awareness, which is in need of purification from the bad smells, bad habits, the ignorances, false beliefs, distorted opinions, all that darkness in the beginning that must go through a process of sublimation and distillation. Jung adds to this idea in the footnotes of the psychology of the transference, calling in us what is to be sublimated and distilled as evil odors and vapors that infect the mind of the labyrinth. Again, it is this mercurial fire whose condensation stimulates the process which leads to sublimation or transformation and distillation or purification, both purifying the odors and vapors and transforming consciousness to a higher level of awareness. With all this said, I want to use the remainder of this chapter in the psychology of the transference to summarize and conclude this image before we visit the next woodcut of the king and queen. This image attempts to capture the archetypal beginnings and thus endings of individuation. The ego, on this journey of expanding consciousness, must first open up to the eternal grounds it lies on. The focus is on the all-in-one, Mercurius, the self. And to the mere ego, it is all a massa confusa, to the point where we in our civilized society have not a clue about the psyche. Our modern behavioral psychology is focused on the ego, both how to make it safe and meet its wants, its needs, as well as the various complexes it twists itself into. But rarely a faint whisper is heard about the psyche itself, its own wholeness, its own instinctual movements, and the reality of it in itself. And these whispers turn silent on what happens when the subject gives the unconscious space to be known. Jung captures it best. Most human difficulties, including neurotic and psychic disassociation, are linked with an ego that is not functioning in accordance with the total disposition of the psyche. There is a kind of disharmony between it and the makeup of the psyche. The conscious personality is in disharmony with the wealth of vitality of the unconscious. The overflow of the unconscious falls into too narrow a vessel. One of the main tasks of therapeutic treatment, therefore, is to try to enrich the range of emotional reactions so that the vessel is larger and more solid and can receive the emotional impulses from the unconscious. Therefore, one of the most essential problems of the human race is to build an ego which functions in a healthy manner, that is, in accordance with the instinctive makeup of the total anthropos. On one hand, we are distinguished from other animals by having a strong ego complex, and on the other, our greater consciousness presents us with the danger of a split. When the vessel of consciousness is too narrow, unable to catch itself through projections, because, as I said earlier, our psychology is there to please the ego and not the soul, then there is that great danger of a split. But you see, this is the purpose of inner alchemy. It is what the allegory of the philosopher's stone alludes to. It's a cracking open of that ego, and healing that split between conscious and unconscious. But before conscious and unconscious union, before cracking the ego open, it begins with what this first image depicts, the awareness of the wholeness and reality of the eternal nature of consciousness. Now, I want to revisit the end of this chapter from the psychology of the transference, as Jung summarizes this first woodcut, as well as provides us a general ground plan for individuation. He writes, "This structure reveals the tetrameria, the fourfold nature of the transforming process, already known to the Greeks. It begins with the four separate elements, the state of chaos, and ascends by degrees to the three manifestations of Mercurius in the inorganic, organic, and spiritual worlds, and after obtaining the form of Sol and Luna, i.e. the precious metals gold and silver, but also the radiance of the gods who overcame the strife of elements by love, it culminates in the one and indivisible, incorruptible, ethereal, eternal nature of the anima, the quinta essentia, aqua permanens, tincture, or lapis philosophorum. This progression from the number 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 is the axiom of Maria, which runs in various forms throughout the whole of alchemy like a leitmotif. If we set aside the numerous chemical explanations, we come to the following symbolic ground plan. The initial state of wholeness is marked by the four mutually antagonistic tendencies, 4 being the minimal number by which a circle can be naturally and visibly defined. This, as Jung puts it, is the ground plan for the journey of individuation. To individuate is to stand as a one, just as the alchemical formula of the 4 leads to the one, the lapis philosophorum, the self. Jung continues on this idea. The reduction of this number aims at a final unity. The first to appear in the progression is the number 3, a masculine number, and out of it comes the feminine number 2. Male and female inevitably constellate the idea of sexual union as the meanings of producing the one, which is then consistently called the Philis Regis, or Philis Philosophorum. Following the progression of numbers, Jung notices a masculine and feminine tied to the above-mentioned transformation formula. Without the opposite genders in their union, there is no production of the one. The same goes for the four, as Jung adds, the quaternity is one of the most widespread archetypes and has also proved to be one of the most useful schema for representing the arrangement of the functions by which the conscious mind takes its bearings. It is like the crossed threads in the telescope of our understanding. The cross formed by the points of the quaternity is no less universal and has its addition in the highest possible moral and religious significance for Western man. Similarly, the circle, as the symbol of completeness and perfect being, is a widespread expression for heaven, sun, and God. It also expresses the primordial image of man and the soul. 4 is the minimal number by which order can be created, represents the pluralistic state of the man who has not yet attained inner unity, hence the state of bondage and disunion, of disintegration, and of being torn into different directions, an antagonizing, unredeemed state which longs for union, reconciliation, redemption, healing, and wholeness. The triad appears as masculine, i.e., as the active resolve or agents whose alchemical equivalence is the upwelling. In relation to it, the dyad is feminine, the receptive, absorbent, or the maternal that still has to be formed and impregnated, information impregnatio. The psychological equivalent of this triad is want, desire, instinct, aggression, and determination, whereas the dyad corresponds to the reaction of the psychic system as a whole to the impulse or decision of the conscious mind. Here, Jung is expanding on the idea of upwelling and impregnating, another eternal pair tied to consciousness. The upwelling is the active masculine, the instinct, desire, impulse, whereas the impregnating is the receptive, feminine, and reaction to an active upwelling, to the impulse or decisions of the conscious mind. Through these reflections, we can see how consciousness moves in and through itself, unfolding and enfolding. One can also notice how these actions both separately work in their own manner, yet work together as a one. It is a great symbol to capture the movements of consciousness, as well as apply it to your own life, in your own upwellings and impregnations. Ultimately, this is what the symbol of the fountain displays, the upwelling of the mercurial water through, out, and back into itself provides a symbolic view on what the alchemists were hinting at. And speaking of symbolism, Jung provides an essential insight into this idea, connecting back to the initial text we began with that's attributed to this Mercurial Fountain. The text that follows the picture of the Mercurial Fountain is mainly concerned with the water of the art, i.e. mercury. Here I will only say that this fluid substance, with all of its paradoxical qualities, really signifies the unconscious which has been projected into it. The sea is its static condition, the fountain its activation, and the process its transformation. The integration of unconscious contents is expressed in the idea of the elixir, the medicina catholica or universalis, the arum potabilis, the cibus sempiternus, everlasting food, the health-giving fruits of the philosophical tree, the vinum ardens, and all the other innumerable synonyms. Some of them are decidedly ominous, but no less characteristic, such as succus lunarae or lunatica, juice of the moon plant, aqua saturni, note that Saturn is a baleful deity, poison, scorpion, dragon, son of the fire, boys or dogs' urine, brimstone, devil, etc. Although it's not expressly stated in the text, the gushing up and flowing back of the Mercurial Fountain within its basin completes a circle, and this is an essential characteristic of Mercurius, because he is also the serpent that fertilizes, kills, and devours itself, and brings itself to birth again. We may mention in this connection that the circular sea with no outlet, which perpetually replenishes itself by means of a spring bubbling up in its center, is to be found in Nicholas of Acusa as an allegory of God. Nicholas of Acusa's allegory of God reads, God is the source, river, and sea, which contains all the same water. The Trinity is a life that proceeds from itself, to itself, by the way of itself. So we're beginning to see the grounds of individuation take shape. And while a lot of this series is on the instincts, on the unconscious, and all of that which eludes the ego, it is through the ego that the work's carried. And without it, there is no work. As Jung says, this, speaking of the movement of the fountain, would of course perish of inanition if it did not succeed in overcoming the inertia of the merely natural man and achieving its object despite his laziness and constant resistance. But by dint of compulsion or persuasion, the conscious mind is able to carry through its purpose, and only in the resultant action is a man living a whole and a unity. In the beginning was the deed, as Faust says, provided that the action is the mature product of a process embracing the whole psyche, and not just a spasm or impulse that has the effect of suppressing it. So as I like to say, the unconscious, thyself, Mercurius is there, and all that's required is you. This is a key aspect to the alchemists, not only the divine and psychic, but also the physical and matter. And to wrap up this section, Jung describes the individuation process as an experience of a subject who discovers that what he has projected into the retort is his own darkness, his unredeemed state, his passion, his struggles to reach the goal, i.e., to become what he really is, to fulfill the purpose for which his mother bore him, and after the peregrinations of a long life filled of confusion and error, to become the Philus Regis, son of the Supreme Mother. Fundamentally, it is the same theme, the same axioma Mariae, telling how Rosenkreutz is transformed out of his former unenlightened condition and comes to realize that he is related to royalty. But in keeping with its period, beginning of the 17th century, the whole process is far more projected, and the withdrawal of the projection into the hero, which in Faust's case turns him into a Superman, is only fleetingly hinted at. Yet the psychological process is essentially the same. The becoming aware of those powerful contents which alchemy sensed in the secrets of matter. This is where we're headed, to the secrets of matter, the hidden and spiritually psychic. And our next woodcut leads us to the king and queen.